welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I am your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Tuesday, August 13th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start with a little bit of breakdown of the AP poll that came out yesterday, a number of things to break down with the poll, but also some history was made with it, and then some trends to watch throughout the season that we will get into in the first segment. Then we'll get into some prize and disappointing teams throughout this upcoming season in college football. I have one from each of the Power 4 conferences, one surprise, one disappointment. So we'll get into that in the second segment. Then we'll get into the biggest leaps that title contenders need to take this year. We've gotten into this the last couple of days. This will likely be the last day, but maybe I'll do one more, who knows. Then we'll get into a little talk around fall camp intel. We'll likely do this throughout the week. As you know, there were a ton of scrimmages this past week, a couple of injuries. I want to make sure you guys are fully updated on all of that before we get to a recruiting update to finish things out. And there is a unlikely team that is making some real noise in the recruiting world right now. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and you can use the gsmcpodcast.net link if that's easier for you. But also, we now have Super Chat. So on the Sports Network page, if you're in the chat, you can likely see a little $sign at the bottom of the chat. You're welcome to leave any question, any comment that you have in there, and I will absolutely have you. First of all, you'll see it on the screen, which is kind of a fun interactive thing for both of us here, but also it helps us out a lot. It's definitely a huge thing to keep the content that you love coming to you, so definitely a huge thing for us. If you would like to use that, you're more than welcome to. Also, we do still have the gsmcpodcast.net page if that's a little bit easier for you. But let's go ahead and jump right in here, and let's talk about the preseason AP poll that came out yesterday. Obviously, it's a preseason poll, so there's only so much you can take from it, but there are a couple of really interesting trends, a couple of history things that I want to get into, and definitely some interesting tidbits to pull out of this. But let's go ahead and jump in, and first let's just start with the poll. So it is Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, and Texas. That's roughly the order that I expected them to go in. I think you could flip Texas and Oregon if you really wanted to, but that's the way I had it in mind, so more than fine with that. Georgia got the overwhelming number of first place votes, which makes sense. Again, a team with that type of quarterback, with that type of system, and the pedigree behind them, it's no real question, right? Then you have Alabama at 5, you got Ole Miss at 6, the same way that I had it, Notre Dame at 7, the exact same way that I had it. Then there's some difference. I did not have Michigan in my top 10. They have them sitting at 9, which we'll get to why that's a big deal here in a second. Florida State sneaks into the top 10 right there. Missouri right outside the top 10. Utah I'm obviously a little bit higher on than some people are. I do have them in my top 10 at that 8 position, but they do not. So definitely an interesting thing to watch there. Tennessee seems to be hanging out right in that 15 realm. Oklahoma a little bit higher on this list than I would have them, but at the end of the day, it's splitting hairs. Once you get down to this 15 to 25 mark, it's absolutely crazy the way you could put this. Miami a little bit low if you were to ask me. I believe I had them at 16 yesterday, and frankly I've seen people that have put them even higher. So definitely a team that has a lot of hype going into this season and expects to have a huge one. A&M makes the list. Arizona, Kansas, a little bit of run of Big 12 teams there, and then USC, NC State, and Iowa close it out. So a good group of teams here. Obviously roughly like what I had yesterday. I did have Iowa State in my top 25, so that's one team that I think likely should be in here. I think UCF is another team that could argue that they should be in here as well. So definitely some arguments around, who made it, who didn't, but at the end of the day, it's a preseason poll. Once the ball kicks off, we'll get a much better idea of how right this is, but there's definitely some things that I want to break down from this. First of all, in terms of the conference breakdown, SEC has 9 of these teams, Big 10 6, Big 12 5, and ACC 4, so SEC is really running away with this thing, with all the others kind of grouped together a little bit. The Big 10 and the SEC both have 4 in the top 5, or top 10, excuse me. So that would definitely kind of lean things a little bit more in the Big 10 direction. There is those 4 teams, and then not really sure what else happens after that. So definitely kind of it gives you an idea of how that conference is really shaking out going into this year. But let's get into a couple of different history things that were kind of made within this ranking, and there are a number of different things to break down here. First, we'll start with Michigan, the lowest rated reigning champion since the 2011 Auburn team that lost just about everyone, and Cam Newton was just about everyone. So definitely makes sense that they were all the way down at 23, which is actually pretty wild considering today when even 9 looks a little bit low for the reigning national champion. So definitely some interesting things there. Obviously, Michigan, losing the amount of people they did, not overly surprising by any means, but definitely something that is really interesting and something to watch as we head into the year. Texas has its highest ranking since 2009. Oregon highest ranking in program history. Ole Miss highest ranking since 1970, all the way back then. So huge year for them. Ole Miss highest preseason ranking since 2008, and Kansas highest ranking since 2009. So a lot of teams making their highest point in a long, long time. Obviously, Texas has been well documented. We understand that this is a huge year for them and one where they feel like they're back at the table for the first time in quite some time. Oregon, obviously, is going into this year with as much hype as really has ever been around that program. Obviously, the Chip Kelly years were absolutely incredible, but there were a number of years where you still felt like there were a couple of teams at the end that they just weren't going to be able to deal with. That doesn't feel like the case this year. They feel like a team that can absolutely win a national title. Same thing with Ole Miss. Going all the way back to 1970 is pretty wild, but Ole Miss is a program and a team that has been sitting pretty dormant for a long time, but is very talented and obviously has a ton going into this year. Missouri coming off an incredible year last year. They are right where they should be. And then Kansas, kind of making their way up in the college football world. They used to be kind of a laughing stock of sorts, but they are finally where they should be, which is towards the top of this sport and back in the conversation. So very much like that team. Jalen Daniels' health is obviously the number one thing, but definitely will be an awesome team to watch. Also, we get a number of games between the top 10 preseason teams. We get 8 of the games throughout the season, and frankly, I tried to count these. I believe I got all of them. I'm 99% sure I got all of them, but Georgia plays number 4, 5, and 6 in these rankings, so gives you an idea of why people are a little bit worried about what Georgia can do this upcoming year. Ohio State plays 3, 8, and 9, so it's not like they get a really easy schedule to jump off of. Obviously, the other 9 games are not necessarily world beaters by any means, but when you play 3 top 10 teams going into the season, that's definitely going to be a tall order. Michigan could be a very different team by that time, but at the end of the day, these are 3 very quality teams on that schedule. Oregon obviously plays Michigan as well, a huge matchup, the one of the matchups that I'm circling likely the most as we head into this Big Ten season. And then Notre Dame and Florida State is the last one here. So this is obviously incredible. I think one of the coolest things here is November 2nd is going to be loaded. You have Oregon, Michigan, you have Ohio State, Penn State, you have Georgia, Ole Miss, and then you have October 12th, which is Ohio State, Oregon is the only one on here, but there's a lot of incredible matchups that day. LSU plays Ole Miss. We have we have Texas playing Oklahoma that day. So many huge games on that day. So love that these games are a little bit spread out. I do love that November 2nd is going to be kind of an incredible day, but overall, I think when you get a number of spread out games in a 12 or among the top 10 teams in the country, it's always a great thing. You can have that marquee game on the weekend and then fill everything else with the number of other great games that are happening pretty much every single week this upcoming year. So this is going to be absolutely awesome. I think these are the games that you'll look back on and say, these are likely the ones that define the college football playoff this upcoming year. Whether it's Georgia stumbling a couple of times in those 3 games, or Texas getting beaten by Georgia, or Oregon losing to Ohio State and Michigan, what have you. There's a number of games on here. Notre Dame playing Florida State might be the most consequential game of the year for them. So definitely going to be a huge number of games here. And if you expand it to the top 15, I believe you go all the way up to 15 games that you can see between the top 15 teams this upcoming year. And frankly, I could have missed a couple there as well. So definitely a huge thing there. The only top 15 team that doesn't play another top 15 team this year is Utah. So definitely a team to watch. It looks like their schedule is definitely leaning towards them, and it sounds like that's going to be exactly the case. So definitely will be a fun thing to watch. But let's get into some of the trends to watch throughout this thing, because it's obviously a preseason poll. You can't take too much out of it, but there's definitely some things to watch for throughout the season. And we'll start with, in 20 of the last 21 seasons, the preseason top 10 team has finished unranked in the AP poll. I think there's a number of options here. I think Michigan is likely the easiest pick of the group because of all the changes, because of all the people walking out the door, and the outside noise can't help by any means. So an 8-4 season would likely get them out of the top 25, and I think that's likely in the cards for Michigan. Not necessarily picking that by any means, but definitely something that could happen. Florida State is another team that I'm watching with if DJ does not hit the ground running the way they need to, they're a team that could lose to Notre Dame. They could lose to SMU. They could lose to Clemson and Miami, and that would put them probably outside the top 25. So definitely one to watch there. Notre Dame is still a little bit up in the air because the passing game is a little bit worrisome still for me. I think the offensive tackles have to come along in quite some way. So there's a world where it looks pretty ugly and disjointed, but the schedule definitely leans itself to them being a top 25 team at the end of the day. Ole Miss and Penn State are two teams that I don't expect to find their way into this category, but definitely could. Ole Miss faces a very, very tough schedule, and Penn State, that offense is going to look stagnant at some point, but if it looks stagnant throughout the year, then they're going to have a real problem on their hands. And then Alabama is the final team that I think this could realistically happen to. Maybe it happens to Texas or Oregon, but I wouldn't necessarily put a bet on that by any means. I think when you have all the changes at Alabama, there's always going to be that question, right? There definitely could be a fall off the cliff type season. I don't expect that by any means, but definitely is in the cards for Alabama this upcoming year. You also have all 10 teams to win a national title in the CFP era. We're ranked in the top 10 heading into the season. So if you're a fan of Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, Texas, Bama, or Ole Miss, you feel pretty good about where you're sitting right now because history is in your favor. The thing about that is only one number one team as we go into the season has won the national title, which was 2017 Alabama, and they didn't even win the SEC. That was the year they lost to Georgia in the SEC, they didn't go to the SEC title. Why am I mistaking this? Yes, they didn't go to the SEC title and then found a way to beat Georgia in the championship game. So obviously, is going to be an incredible year. UGA being that number one team could spell a little bit of disaster for them. Obviously, I'm picking Georgia to go quite a ways in here, but did not pick them to win a national title. So both of these would hold up in my prediction. So definitely will be an interesting thing to watch. But there's definitely a ton going into this year. I think you look at this preseason poll, and obviously it's not the craziest thing in the world. We've seen these polls before, and a lot of them have fallen apart pretty quickly. But at the end of the day, there are a couple of trends that you really do want to watch throughout the season. You know, those top 6 teams winning the national title, that top 1 team not winning the national title is definitely something to watch as we head into this season. But we'll take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the surprising and disappointing teams in this upcoming year. I have one from every Power 4 conference, so we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.